Hi, my name is Aisha Harrison, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my work. I am a WSU grad and proud, so I hope you enjoy my slide talk. I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera off for the rest of the talk. Thanks. I wanted to put in some of my earlier work so you could see what I was making while I was here at WSU and also shortly after that. So these are some pieces that I made here. I came to WSU from teaching in Atlanta, Georgia, 3rd and 4th grade. And I thought maybe teaching was my path and realized shortly after doing it for a year that it was definitely not my path. And so I actually came to WSU as after I already had a BA in Spanish from Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa. And I came here to work more with the figure and try to figure out what I was going to make my work about. So these are some pieces that came right after I left school. And when I moved back to Olympia from WSU, I didn't know anybody. And so I found the local clay chapter, and this guy named Dave let me use his kiln and his space to make work. And I was also painting a lot. So like I said, I didn't really know what I was going to make work about. And so I was working at Home Depot and applying to different residency programs, and I got into one at the Women's Studio Workshop in upstate New York. And they actually let me go for 5 weeks and still have my job. I was in a different position when I got back, but I still had a job, which was a pretty amazing thing. And so when I was at the Women's Studio Workshop, I tried to think about what I could actually make work about, what would actually be substantial enough for me to make a lot of work about. And I decided that I would make work about my identity. And at the time, I was really thinking a lot about how I was both white and black and how that had affected my life. And so I want to say up front that this talk kind of chronicles that journey and that I'm in a very different place now about my identity, but I don't want to come with my current understanding and kind of impose that on my older work. So I'm going to try to just be as I'm just going to try to tell it like it happened. I just want to also sprinkle in throughout the talk a few of my influences. So like I'd mentioned before, I had a degree in Spanish, which at Grinnell meant Spanish and Latin American literature. So I did a lot of reading, and I also looked at a lot of art, and I was really interested in the ways that they explored mixed identity, and also how there were these coded elements in their artwork that would read one way to the Spanish and a different way to Indigenous folks that made them or wrote them. And I was also super excited about the magical realism, where things were grounded in the real world but had magical or symbolic elements mixed in. So I felt very connected to those concepts and ideas. I also started researching other artists who were making work about identity. Adrian Piper was one of the first people I found, and I'm still very enthralled with her work. So while I was at the Women's Studio Workshop, I made a series of very large heads, and I was trying to think about hair because hair was a pretty sensitive topic for me, complicated. I had been told a lot, but when I was younger, that I had quote unquote good hair, and which was kind of a compliment, but rooted in white supremacy and beauty standards. And it also distanced me from my Black family. And so it was this kind of strange mix of things. And I thought it would be an interesting place to begin thinking. I also think about hair as DNA and sort of connecting me to my roots, my ancestors. So I used those big heads to apply to graduate school, and I applied to several places, and one of the places I got in was the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and so I decided to go there. It was a really interesting experience, very challenging. As far as the work, there was a lot of longing. I didn't really know who I was, kind of, or how I was connected, who I belonged to. I felt a lot of not belonging. And so the work's kind of lonely and with a lot of longing. So I continued to use hair throughout graduate school, and I still use it now. So in graduate school, I started making larger pieces. So this piece is almost life-size. They started to be kind of narrative and more interactive in a way. Like I was thinking more sculpturally, like what does this look like in the round? So here's another one of my influences, Arthur Gonzalez. I was really interested in Arthur Gonzalez's work. I still am. And actually saw a poster of his work at WSU by the wedging tables. And I was so enthralled with his piece that I saw there and what I looked at afterwards. And I am fascinated by his use of narrative and also his use of other materials. Like this is placed, it's like attached to a rug. And so I don't know, I just felt like he was doing some of the things I wanted to do. So I want to say that graduate school was super lonely. I didn't have anybody to talk to. I didn't know what I was doing really. I didn't have a lot of mentors who understood where I was coming from. I didn't have any language to describe what I was thinking about. It was super frustrating, but I just kept making the work anyway and trying to explain it as best as I could. And I got through it. I lived to tell the tale. So in all of these works, I was trying to get at the complexities of how I was identifying, how I was feeling, the emotional impacts. And I was paying a lot of attention to posture. I spent hours and hours doing photo shoots where I would get into different postures and sort of feel my way through them and try to figure out how I could communicate how I was feeling through just my posture, the way my body felt. I've been really super inspired by performance artists as well, like Yoko Ono, Marina Abramovich, and Rebecca Belmore. This is a piece by Yoko Ono called Cut Piece. This is just a couple of stills, but you can watch it on YouTube. And I saw it performed by a different artist at the Penland School of Crafts, which is an amazing place. I highly recommend you check it out. If you haven't heard of it, go look it up. They have workshops in the summers, and then they have longer things in the falls and spring. And so highly recommend. Anyway, I saw this performed at Penland, and it really changed my life. It changed how I thought about art. It changed that I could see what art could do I witnessed my own transformation at watching this piece happen. And it was like an aha, like, wow, art could really change you. So this is some work from my MFA thesis show. This piece is called Black, White, Brown. And I was really interested in interaction and having the viewer play a role in this work. And so the figure is it's like 3/4 of my scale. And she's literally cut in half and hollowed out. And so you can see inside of her interior. And the panels are black and white. They're black on one side, white on the other, and brown on the edges. And I was interested in the ways that she would look against the white panels and against the black panels, and how she was not white or black. And I also was interested in the way that the two figures were separated. And so there was a space between them, and they were facing each other. So it was kind of mirror-like, which I liked. And also it created a pathway for a viewer to walk through. And I was imagining that viewer walking through that space and sort of cutting that person in half, which is how I felt at the time when people asked me what I was. What are you? I felt like they were asking me to choose. And also that's a demeaning question, because I'm not an animal. Well, I am an animal, but I'm also a human being. But I got asked that all the time when I was younger. What are you? This is another artist I've looked at a lot, Elizabeth Catlett. And this piece in particular influenced this next work. So this piece is about being tokenized. And so because of my lighter skin and less kinky hair, and because of the way that I grew up, I seem like a safe Black person to invite into white spaces like the Academy. And so that experience is what I was trying to capture here, how it felt and how it feels to be tokenized. So there's the relationship of the figures to each other, the relationship of the figures to the table, that they're in different places, different relationship to the table. And also that I was invited, but I was not invited wholly. Like, not all parts of me were invited. And I've learned that the more I speak up about racism, the less I get tokenized. So that's just something I've learned since this piece. So hair again, this time a lot bigger. And I'm curious about this piece now. I know I said I wouldn't put my current thinking on things, but I called this piece Connect, and I felt like this person was trying to connect with this sort of bigger Blackness, I think. And I'm curious how this figure doesn't have any hair. This person's bald. And so looking back, I can really see where I was at the time. I think this piece is really vulnerable, and that is how I felt about things at that time. I also, this piece, I showed this piece to a visiting artist, and she said, if you don't show your faces, the faces of your figures, no one's going to buy these. And so, then the idea of like, what am I making this work for? Like, who's it for? Really started to come into my consciousness. So then I had applied and I got into residency at Baltimore Clay Works, and I made this show called Contours of Belonging. And in Baltimore, my questions started changing considerably. It was the first time I'd been in primarily Black spaces, and that really shifted how I was thinking about myself. I was also around a lot of people who are mixed, which was the first time for that as well. And so I got asked different questions. I didn't get the "what are you" question. Nobody asked me what I was. Everyone assumed I was Black. And in fact, different questions like, "what are you mixed with?" were questions that I got in Baltimore. And so it was a really interesting and different experience for me. It expanded what my ideas were about what it meant to be Black. And I think was really a good experience for me to have. And yeah. So I also made in that same show these 3 men. These are 2 of them. And I showed them in a dark room. So the room was pretty much pitch black. You could barely see the figures, but you could see them enough that you would know where they were. And I was curious about how these postures were performed and felt by different viewers. So some people would hesitate in the door and not really want to go in, and they would wait until their eyes could adjust and decide if these people were safe or not. Other people, people who identified with these postures, just walked straight into the room. And so, and that was similar actually to the last piece where that circle was being drawn around that figure, and the adults would all skirt the circle, but the kids would run straight through the circle. So I was kind of interested in like, where do we draw these lines of who we belong to, who we belong with, how we belong, and what are in this piece particularly, what are some of these signals or signs that we get, whether we belong or not? What was curious about this piece too is that after people got into the room, different people started taking the postures kind of behind or next to the figures. And so then it was sort of created this double or triple effect where there were the new viewer coming in didn't know whether the pieces were alive or, whether they were seeing a real person or a clay person. So I was kind of curious about that as well. It's kind of an experiment. So when I got back to Olympia, I moved back to Olympia. I got a job at the Evergreen State College where I was teaching part-time and then working in my studio part-time. Well, working in my studio full-time and teaching part-time. And so I was trying to figure out, I was thinking back to graduate school, and one of my professors had asked me, what are you going to make when you get over being biracial? Which is super offensive question to ask. And she said some more things too, which I won't repeat here, but I was like, what would be, she encouraged me to make something universal. And I thought, what would be universal? What does universal mean? And who gets to make universal work? I don't really believe in universal. So, everything is influenced by the maker, by your perspective. You can't make something that's not you, that doesn't have you in it. And so I made these pieces trying to make something universal. And looking back at them now, it's so funny how the content that I had been exploring before still comes through loud and clear. Robert Arneson is another one of the artists that I have looked at a lot. He's a clay artist from the funk movement in California, and he made primarily self-portraits. And so, clay self-portraits, it makes sense that I would be looking at him. I was really curious about this piece in particular, though, because throughout graduate school, I had been doing a lot of brown clay with white covering over it. I had tried a bunch of clay surfaces like glazes and other clays, like layering them on top of the white, and nothing ever felt right. And then I saw this piece, and it kind of triggered in me something like that I didn't have. I think this is probably glaze, but it didn't have to be a ceramic surface that I put on top, that I could try some other things. And so I also, at a similar time, I had seen this work by Baja Erland, and it's a book. Well, she made this book and covered it in salt. And also at the same time, I had heard about Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt because she disobeyed God. And so sort of all three of these things melded together and got me thinking about salt as a potential for being that white covering over the brown clay. And so I embarked on this salt journey. Salt is a really interesting material because it has a really long history, and it has been traditionally a marker of privilege in some cultures, where if you were above the salt, that meant that you had money, and if you were below the salt, you didn't have as much. It's also been like Gandhi said that if we can get our own salt and make our own salt, mine our own salt, then we can be free. And there's a salt rebellion. So it's something we need. It's our tears are salty. There's just so many elements about salt that really got me thinking and felt like it was a right fit for expressing some complexity to these issues that I'm thinking about. So I started encrusting my ceramic work. So the ceramics are fired, and then I'm putting this salt on top. And at the time, I had thought about this salt as the sort of residue left over from privilege, whether having it or not having it, that these systems make it so that whether or not you have privilege, that residue is still left on you. So I was also thinking about the ways, like, where does the privilege live? Is it inside of our body or just on the surface? And so there was some pieces in the series that had the salt kind of either spewing out of a brown person's mouth, or being kind of ingested or re-ingested. And what I find curious about the salt now is that over time, the salt has migrated onto the clay in places where it wasn't before. So, for example, on the one on the right, the face was completely free of salt, mostly until, I let it sit for a long time and it changed. And so I feel like that is also an interesting way to think about, or another layer to the metaphor of the salt as a marker of privilege. And then I had a baby and things changed. My life, everything in my life changed. And it was a really beautiful time, and also was really challenging to make clay work, which is dirty and takes a long time and a lot of tending when you have this other being that takes a lot of time and tending. And so I was fortunate enough to be asked to do a work with a group of students, a collaboration with a class at South Sound Community College in Olympia. And so this teacher asked me to come in and demonstrate how I worked, and then mostly it was about how to install this work. And so the students made the bones, and then I went in and we installed it together. It was a pretty cool collaboration. I did have a little bit of time to work at home, and I was still making the salt work, and these were the last 2 salt pieces that I made. I think it's interesting to look at how they shifted over time, and how the last figure I made isn't covered in salt at all. And I think what I realized through that series was that I was talking about a residue of privilege, but I was also talking about whiteness. And so this last figure is sitting on the pile of salt and reading a book, which is, you can't see in the picture, but it's Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress. So it's a different relationship to whiteness and to thinking about privilege. So I want to talk a little bit about my process because I think it's really important for how moving forward with my work, like what happened after Io was born. So I use a couple of processes. One is based on the Progoff intensive journaling method developed by Ira Progoff, and the other is touch drawing, which was developed by Deborah Koff-Chapin. And these 2 processes help me collaborate with beings greater than myself. So they help me be in tune with my conscious self, my subconscious self, and then the greater collective consciousness of ancestors, both human and non-human. Both processes are very internal. You drop in or drop down or go down your well, and experience your thinking through kind of a different lens, in a different place, a different space. So during these sessions, I allow myself to be in this state of real openness, and I let images and words come through without any filtration, without any filtering of what I think is good or not good. And that is a state that you have to practice. So I've practiced a lot, and I can sort of drop in really quick now, but it takes a lot of practice. And I often go down my well and end up in a cave. And caves remind me about how bodies are so important to me in my work. My clay body, my physical body, the human body, the earth as a body, bodies of water, society as a body. I'm really interested and fascinated with internal and external bodies and in the transitions between the two. And when I drop down, it feels like letting go and going inside of a body or a space like a womb or a cave. And it's generative and humming with life and expansive and dark and mysterious and beautiful. And it has to do with searching and dreaming, drifting, observing ancestors and collaboration. So these are a couple of touch drawings. You can see they're very ephemeral, kind of. They come very quickly. So in a touch drawing session, I might make between 20 and 50 drawings. And they're very fast and don't have, I don't spend very long elaborating on them, or I just move to the next drawing. And then when I'm done, I make the titles. So I title each one. And then those titles can then become new work, or they become a jumping off stone to do some journaling with. And in the journaling sessions, I actually go and talk to these beings and ask them what they want to be or what they want to become. And that's really useful for helping me develop my work. So around the time that I was learning touch drawing, there were a lot of things happening at my school where I was teaching at. There was a big uprising with students, primarily students of color, and white allies. And there was it was pretty intense. I worked with the students who were trying to hold the administration accountable for the racial climate on campus. And they were also trying to raise issues about campus police as well as other issues. And so because of the nature of the uprising and how big it ended up being, there was a lot of doxing and other things by white supremacists in the area, and there ended up being a white supremacist rally, and there was a big police force that came. There were bomb threats. It was a lot to deal with. So the next year, when people came back to school, things were still really tense, and I helped to found a group called Staff and Faculty Acting for Equity, and we worked with students to make a few events. And one of the events, my part was to do an art component. So these are some of I made some prints to hand out to give away to everyone who participated. So during the event, students, staff, and faculty carved these linoleum blocks and then printed them on fabric. And then we hand sewed the fabric together in sewing circles all around campus, which I facilitated. And then after that, we quilted all the parts together, and it was hung during graduation the following year. So that was sort of my work that I was part of the stuff I was doing at where I was teaching. And then in my home practice, I was trying to figure out how to hold all of this stuff in my body. It just felt like it felt really overwhelming. There was a lot going on, and my students were being threatened, and I was being threatened. It was just there was just so much, and I was watching my friends being mistreated, and so I was just trying to hold it all. And the practices that I mentioned, the Progoff style writing and the touch drawing, really helped me to connect to a deeper sense of myself and to my kin, my ancestors, and not just my human ones, but also my animal and plants that we are around all the time. And so these carvings came from touch drawings primarily, and you can see how they're sort of related, but the carvings are maybe just a little bit more refined, or maybe a lot more refined, or they kind of take one part of the idea that came through the touch drawing. Here's a few more of the carvings. So this was a time when my kid was really little, and I just didn't have a lot of time in the clay studio, so I was doing a lot of work that was less, where I didn't have to be down in my studio. I could be anywhere in the house, just carving a few things here and there, and I could take breaks easily. And so this is what I was working on during those times. Here are a couple more. And so I compiled all of these into one sort of work. I thought of it kind of like a cloud called How It's Held. So you can see there's lots of the carvings in there. And then there's some touch drawing collages as well, where I took touch drawings and layered them and mounted them on wood frames. There's also poetry, because the touch drawing titles can become poems as well. I also make these self-portraits. I haven't made one this year yet, but I've made them for a while every year, and this was the one for 2018. I made it at a residency at Watershed in Maine. I made quite a bit of different work there too. I have another piece I made there later in the show, but so yeah, this was my self-portrait. Not necessarily trying to get a likeness, but trying to get at the feeling of where I was at in 2018. So I needed more tools, and I started to spin on a drop spindle. So this is some of my early yarn that I was making. And this, the piece on the right is my hand spun yarn that I put onto a blanket that was my great grandmother's blanket. And you can see it's based on that carving on the left, which was based on a touch drawing that was from quite a long time before that. I started paying more attention to the animals and plants that were coming through in the touch drawings and journal writing sessions. I became a salmon watcher for the Nisqually tribe, and I went to this river several times a week for 6 months and observed the salmon. And in the training leading up to that, I learned that over 137 species rely on salmon directly for survival. And I also learned about the importance of salmon to the people who are the original inhabitants of this land that I live on, that I feel so deeply connected to, the Coast Salish people. And I feel so grateful to live here, and also acknowledge that this land is stolen. And so it's a complicated thing. This piece represents a prayer for the river that I was watching over for those 6 months. And Shinanum is the name of the river, which it's also called Medicine Creek. And this particular creek was where the Medicine Creek Treaty was signed. And I've done some research about that treaty, and as many of the treaties go, it was not done in good faith. There was something in there, though, about the people retaining their fishing rights, which they've been fighting to maintain for this whole time. So I feel this piece is a prayer for those salmon, and for some of the species that rely on the salmon are on that line that comes out of the mouth. But I also want to acknowledge that salmon, it's not just about food. It is a really deep connection and way of life here in the Pacific Northwest. And I want to say another influence is my mom, Aisha Harrison, and she really has been working with our native plants and animals here in Olympia and Pacific Northwest for a really long time. And I never thought of her as an influence about that necessarily. I thought of her as an art influence, like she helped me because she's an artist, be an artist. And that's true. But she also has always been talking about these animals and plants and learning about the forest and the forest floor and teaching me about that and making paper from, plant material that we can harvest just from our plants in our yard and making our yard a sanctuary for animals who are being displaced by our neighbors who don't want them in their yards. And so these are just a couple pieces that my mom has made over the years. There's a lot more where that comes from. So if you want to see more of her work, you can look her up. But she's been a really big influence, especially now as I'm getting older and seeing how much we are destroying our planet. So I spied these red roots when I was on a hike with my family and was perplexed about what they could be. They were sticking out through some rocks in the bank, and they were so beautiful and excuse me. And so I did some research and figured out that they were red alder roots. And those roots are wiggling through these bank materials into the water and getting nutrients from the water to bring back to their stand. And I also just found out that red alders can break down mineral nutrients from rocks and absorb those into the forest ecosystem as well. So as I'm learning from these plants and animals, how can I offer some reciprocity? How can I be in a two-way relationship instead of just seeing these trees and these animals as resources to be utilized? Where can I give back? So that question of where I can give back is a question that I'm still holding and working through. And those red roots really inspired me and started to feel like more than just roots. They felt like blood and veins and like sort of like the DNA in hair. It felt like a long line that connects us, right, through time. And if you think about how long those roots have to be to get from the alder tree to that flowing water, that long line reminded me of the yarn that I was spinning, and reminds me of DNA and blood. And so that's where I started using them in my work. I'm fascinated by other root systems as well. So growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I've been fortunate to be next to the tree roots that exist after a nurse log has disintegrated underneath. And I'm passing that fascination on to my son, who's pictured on the right there. For me, the roots represent the way that trees stay grounded and stable. They get what the plant needs to survive, and they communicate and cooperate to help other beings around them survive too. So the image on the left is about that, right? About being suspended between the earth and the heavens, or the earth and the stars. One set of roots going up, the other set of roots going down. It's also about that we don't exist just on our own, and that we have a lot of this, at least I have a lot of this feeling of separation, this this you-ness, this me-ness, right? Like I'm my own individual being. But this work is really about taking that apart, that you-ness, that individuality, and seeing us as part of a bigger system, a part of a bigger universe, bigger planet, seeing how we're interconnected to everything around us. Here are a couple more images with the roots and the trees and a mouth. I'm thinking about cycles and life, death, interdependence, nutrients, and ancestors. This is Ancestor 1, and it represents the connections that I, that I feel to plants, to those trees. Those are modeled on cedar trees and fir trees. And the rhino is where those horns come from, and those roots, and they sort of tap into this like solar plexus, or into my heart center. And I'm trying to think about how we are so interconnected, and where we fall. Where do I fall in that interconnection? I also have been working with a collective that I helped to start with Shamika Gagne and Coley Gladney, called the Blackwell Red Thread Collective. And we started working together right before the pandemic. We had been meeting. We were sort of like a art support group in a way. We had been meeting for years to talk about our work and talk about what it means to be who we are in these bodies. But we decided to start working more closely together on actually creating work together right before the pandemic. And so this is the first project we did, which was a storefront window called Starbridge to Your Door. And each of us created parts that we put together, elements that we put together inside of the storefront window. So you can see Ancestor 1 became a part of that installation for a while. This is another piece that we made called Future Blanket 2420. And it is 4,094 lines of yarn. So we stretched and we walked these 4,094 lines, representing the number of human ancestors needed for one person going back 400 years, which is about 12 generations. So each time we walked one of these 12-foot lengths, that was one person that we were representing. It was a really sort of amazing process. And then we put them all together. Shamika did a lot of this work. And then we had the well underneath. And so that you could see the reflection of the line going into infinity, into space, right through the floor. And then the well, the rocks around as the well. And then the picture on the right is my mom and my son looking into the well. So the threads from the yarn from that blanket, or that future blanket, is now being woven into the actual blanket, 2420, so that 400 years from now, our descendants can have it. This is Shamika weaving. Recently, the Blackwell Red Thread Collective was asked to curate some storefront windows in downtown Olympia. And so we put together the theme Seeds to Stars and asked Black artists from our area and slightly beyond our area to submit work for this curation. And we chose these 3 artists, and these are just samples of their work. You can see more if you go to look at the windows in downtown. They'll be down there until November. We also put together a piece for the show. It's not the best image. It's really hard to photograph storefront windows because of the glare. But this is what our image looks like, or what our piece looks like. You can see the blanket in the background there, and it's not done yet, but it's still in process. And we like bringing things back in, kind of remaking things or reusing things as part of the work. You can see that copper moon is another element that was in the first show. One of the things I love so much about this is how the blanket, when we're weaving the blanket, we need some tension. And so there's rocks tied underneath to weigh down the warp. And so those rocks are really beautiful. And so we had them. This piece is kind of about like different layers. And so there's that layer of the red rocks hovering over the kind of ground part, or underground part, which I think is pretty interesting to look at. So this piece is in the show at the museum. It's called To Name a Few, and it's bigger than this image. This image was in 2020, and I made maybe like 50 more since then. So it's actively growing, and it honors Black women, girls, femmes, and trans folks. And basically I find these people, or people give me names of people that they want honored. And then I start with that person's name in the center and then work out from there. Some of them, so the shapes mean different things. So some of them are in honor of people who have died at the hands of police, and others honor people who are alive, and then others still honor people who are no longer with us, but are our ancestors that died in different ways besides state violence. So I utilize the black thread, showing how we're interconnected, and that we have, so it's sort of like the red threads, like this long line. They perform a similar function. So even though a lot of my work deals with ancestors and looking in the past, that doesn't mean it's all about the past. And I really want my work to live in the stream of good trouble that's pushing our country to reckon with its past and live up to its best ideals. This is a very recent piece called The Boat of Hands, and I cast my hands, my mom's hands, my child's hands, and my dad's hands. And so the hands are put together to make kind of a boat form. And then the branches are coming out from the wrists. And I'm trying to get at this sense that we are related to these trees, and they are part of us. And also this sense of being held. This came from a touch drawing session where I was being held by all of my ancestors, and I thought that it would be kind of really meaningful to make the hands sort of the line of people that I have right in my proximity, that are part of my ancestral line. This is another very recent piece. She was just installed in July, and this piece is called Woman with Graves at Her Back. This is my very first large-scale bronze piece. I'm really proud of her. And I've been working for about 10 years to get this piece created. And so she has a cavity underneath her, kind of underneath her ribs, that grows moss, and people signed up to go and tend her and spray the moss and make sure it stays alive. This piece really wants to be alive. She has these graves on her back, and they are kind of like scarification, but also graves. But they're very tactile, and so people rub them, and people bring her flowers. And I mean, pretty much there's something every time I go visit her. There's something, someone has left something, or the community seems to be really interested in her. And I just found out that she is going to be permanently placed in downtown by the water, so that's pretty exciting. To welcome her, we had a ceremony and to plant the moss and also wash her. And there was some, she got to sort of be present in the space. And so the kids put the dirt in, and then the elders put in the moss, and then everybody else watered. And so it was an interesting experience. So she represents an ancestor who survived the journey across the Atlantic. She witnessed many things and survived them. And her bravery and will to live is part of why I'm here today. And I really wanted her to be placed in this sacred place that I live. And I'm so grateful to her for surviving and making it possible for me to be where I am, who I am today. This is the last piece that I have to show you, and this is about self-compassion. And self-compassion is not about like coddling yourself or telling yourself you're perfect or anything like that. It's about realizing what you can do to move your life forward, and also recognizing your own challenges and your awareness, and how things change, and that you have the capacity to change, but also to realize that there's that it's okay to struggle, and it's okay to have your ideas shift over time, and that things do take time. So it's these two hands can be worn, and you can when you have them on, it sort of feels like you're getting a hug, and or you're being comforted, but you don't have to ask for help to get comforted. So it's sort of self-compassion.